Filling the frames of these photographs are more plastic bottles than I care to count. Thousands of single-use plastic bottles completely obscure the floor, and though they're not stacked or organized really, they're sorted by color to create incredible shapes and scenes. A blue water drop contrasting against a background of silvery white. Another scene has swirls of green and blue that evoke the power of the ocean's mighty waves and currents. One photo even has layers of bottles arranged to mimic a seashore, with plastic crashing onto the tiles that are the color of sand. But when you look at these art pieces, it's not the plastic that first catches your eye. It's the mermaids. In each scene, a model in an extravagant tail and full body paint plays the title role in Ben von Wong's campaign called Mermaids Hate Plastic. In a perfect blend of beauty and melancholy, a mythical creature brings attention to the very real issues surrounding single-use plastics in our oceans. And that's not where it ends. In his installation, The Parting of the Plastic Sea, Ben used 168,000 used plastic straws to create a tunnel over 10 feet tall, formed by two waves that are poised to crash down on the models that are dancing through it. It took his team of collaborators over 6 months to collect, clean, and sort the straws that he used. A monumental effort, considering that many straws costs less than $20 if you order them in bulk from overseas. Perhaps his best-known work is a sculpture called Turn Off the Plastic Tap. This installation, which has been replicated numerous times around the world, was a massive water spigot floating 30 feet in the air and spewing plastic debris onto the beautifully manicured lawn of the UN headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. At dusk, the plastic stream was illuminated from within, creating an eerily beautiful glow and sparking conversation that moved the needle of how we think about the plastic problem. Ben von Wong is an impact-driven artist who uses his global recognition and incredible artistic insight to make our world a better place. Join us this week to hear how his blind leap of faith into the world of art photography has led him to have a bigger impact than he ever could have imagined.
Welcome back to the Conservation Connection podcast, where each week we do exactly what it sounds like, introduce you to people working in the field of conservation. I'm Sarah Catherine.
And I'm Chance.
And this is the show.
And it's finally chilly outside here in Columbus, Georgia.
Yes. Columbus, Georgia. Columbus, Ohio has probably been chilly for longer, but...
Yeah, definitely. But here down here in the South, it's only just now starting to get cool, which is lovely. All the humidity is gone. I can do fires in the backyard again. Really enjoying some of this cool weather we're having.
Yes, definitely. Speaking of changing weather, there's obviously been a lot going on with the weather, especially here in the Southeast. You know, we've had hurricane after hurricane, and there's been so many people affected. And that kind of also brings me to like doom scrolling. Even if you're not here in the Southeast, you've probably seen like TikToks, Instagrams, everything about climate change and hurricanes and this and that. And it's so easy to get caught up in it and feel like this helplessness and this hopelessness and this sorrow for the people being affected. And I wanted to kind of talk about how to deal with that, how you and I deal with it. We've talked about it some on the shows previously, but I kind of wanted to bring it up again because I think it's pretty timely.
Yeah, and I think we get into that in this interview a little bit with Ben, who he's an impact-driven artist and he's trying to make change in the world, but he's increasingly focusing on hopeful things and things that we're doing right instead of pointing out things that we're doing wrong. But for me, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but I spend time outside. I mean, when I get lost or I'm just completely sucked into my phone for way too long scrolling, going for a walk on the river, seeing trees, looking at what's flowering or what's growing is really grounding for me. I mean, touch grass is a meme, but it is also super helpful.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely getting outside is helpful. Taking the dogs on a walk is always really nice. And I feel like it's nice for them. It's nice for me.
When they're well behaved, it's nice.
Right. Yeah. When they're not well behaved, it's just stressful. But another way for me is also to make myself put down my phone and work on something else, put my focus on something else, do something creative, get a coloring book or a puzzle or something. Find something else to entertain yourself other than just scrolling on your phone.
Yeah, I find that the act of creation, regardless of what you're making, is really balancing and regulating for me. It can be music. It can be, I love doing printing and block making and stuff like that. Anything that makes me feel like I'm contributing to society, even if society is literally just me and you and our household, is a really good way for me to kind of snap out of that, everything's hopeless, this isn't worth it kind of mentality that I fall into sometimes.
Yeah. And I also found myself in these past few weeks while it seemed like everyone was at Climate Week in New York, right? And it felt like we should be there. It's we're missing out, all of these people who care about the environment, everyone's in New York and doing all of these events. And it felt like we were missing out by not being there. And I kind of assume that some of our listeners might feel the same way of am I doing enough? I'm not there with all of these change makers. What am I doing here? And if you felt that way, like I did, I want to remind you that you are doing enough and it's okay to not be at all of these events. And if you want to be part of something like that, you can also do it on a small scale, get a group of friends or get people at your school to come together and do your own Climate Week event. Even if you're just talking at a round table of oh, what impact can we have? What changes can we make? There's plenty of things that you can stream and be involved in. And know that one day you will get there. You will be having conversations with these people. And also don't be afraid to reach out to people. Send them an email, message them on Instagram. So many people are open to offering guidance, mentorship, and having conversations with people who care.
I feel like our little version of that is having our little eco podcast group. Over the past couple months, we've made friends with a couple of other podcasters in this space that we're really just enjoying being friends with, but also we're probably going to have them on the show and we'll be on their shows and just kind of work together to do the hard work of communicating what's going on in the world to people who, like you, who care. And it does take some real mental fortitude to be it's okay that I'm not at these places. It's okay that I'm not flying around the world to Colombia to go to COP this year, because what I'm doing with all of my heart and all of my soul. And if that's not enough, what's the point, right? So it is enough to just do what you can, when you can, where you can, and know that the conversations you're having, the work that you're doing, the future that you're building for yourself and future generations matters, and it's good.
Yeah, and if you ever want to have those conversations with someone and you feel like you don't have someone to have those conversations with, feel free to text us and have the conversations with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Text the hotline. We love talking to people about this stuff. 706-505-0582. So this week we're talking, like we said, with Ben Von Wong, who is an incredible impact-driven artist. My question for you, Sarah Catherine, as the daughter of a lifelong art teacher, a lovely woman, one of my best friends in the world.
Aww.
What is a piece of art that you have made in your life that you really loved making, or that you're most proud of?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I was lucky enough to go to school with my mom as my art teacher when I was in elementary school. And she began hosting these arts festivals as I was growing up, first at our elementary school, and then they were for the whole county. And I remember, sometimes I'd be helping at the different booths, but I would also get to walk around and participate in the different art going on. And I really always loved working with pastels, oil pastels. And I remember drawing this picture of an elephant, and I don't even know if I still have it or where it is, but I was just so proud of that picture and how it turned out. And I don't know if I gave it more thought. Like, is that really the piece like I'm so proud of, that I love the most that I've ever made? But that's what comes to mind.
That's super funny that you would say that, because if you asked me that question, my answer might be a drawing of an elephant that I did in college. You know, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that I have a degree in biology. I did research, but I also double majored in theater because I would have gone crazy if I just did straight science. So I did basically scenic design as my theater degree, and as an exercise for myself, it wasn't classwork. I was just trying to get better at sketching, like using a pencil alone to draw something semi-realistic, because most of what I've dabbled with is just like big, thick acrylic black paint lines and kind of abstract-y, minimalist stuff. And I sat down one day and I was like, I'm going to do the most photorealistic elephant drawing that I can do. So I pulled up a picture of an elephant, and I probably spent like 5 or 6 hours working on it. And I remember it being like the first piece of art that I showed our scenic designer, this ancient man named Joe Gardner, who is fantastic. He looked at it and he looked at me like I could have something as an artist, which maybe I do, maybe I don't. But it was the first time an artist looked at my work and was like, whoa, that's cool. And so it's just very funny to me that both of us are talking about elephant art pieces.
Yeah, that's so funny. You've never told me that story.
Look at this. The podcast is making our marriage stronger, finding more points of connection between you and me.
I love that. That's cool.
So art is obviously going to be a big theme throughout this episode today. Ben is an amazing artist. He creates these fantasy-scapes. If you want to see some of his art before we get into this conversation, if you're not driving, go to vonwong.com. I've got the link down in the show notes. You can click on it and go check out some of his work. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, I absolutely love his artwork. Like, some of his stuff to me is really relatable and impactful, and people are going to react to it different ways. Like, they're going to have a favorite piece and, you know, ones that they're like, oh, I don't really care for that. And that's kind of the point of art, right? Like, it's subjective.
One of my favorite questions to ask people who are like in the art world is like, what is your definition of art? Because it's like asking, what is your definition of a species to a biologist? Because everybody has their own cutoffs for what is and is not art. Yeah,
it's so different for everyone. And that was part of why we wanted to have Ben on the show, is because we try to talk to artists occasionally. A lot of the times we lean to the more science-heavy side on the show. But I think it's really important to show these different perspectives, and that truly, you know, we say this in most of our episodes, it doesn't matter what you do, you can have an impact on the environment, on the world. So whatever you do, if you're passionate about the planet, find a way to incorporate it.
So with all that being said, please enjoy this interview with Ben Von Wong.
I want to kind of start by going back into your past of like, how did you get interested in the broader scale of art? Were you always interested in art, or did that come later on?
So I was never really good at any art form. I think as a North American Asian kid, I did do a little bit of everything. I did violin. My parents put me through a bunch of different drawing lessons, had all the extra language and linguistics and math and everything, but I was never great at any of it. And so there was never a moment in my childhood where I thought I would end up being an artist.
Yeah.
I didn't study art. I ended up getting a degree in hard rock mining engineering, which is also far from both art and environmentalism. And yet somehow, as life would have it, here I am a couple of years later.
Nice.
So what were the stepping stones from like hard rock mining engineer to activist artist?
Right. So I think as all good stories begin, they start with a breakup. I was working as a hard rock mining engineer in a mining town in Winnemucca, Nevada. And a girl broke up with me. I was bored. I wasn't even 21 years old at the time. And I was like, I'm going to need to find a new hobby or else I'm going to go crazy. And the stars were pretty. So I bought a camera and just tried to learn how to take astrophotography.
Wow, then, that's like a really hard photography thing to get into. Like, you started with the hardest possible discipline. Like, you didn't want to do like architectural or something, landscapes. It was like, no, let's take the tiny little bits of light coming in from the sky and turn that into a photograph. That's amazing.
But I think that's ultimately what got me into it so quickly, because I went to buy the most expensive camera I possibly could at Walmart, which was the only thing that was in town. And then that one wasn't good enough, so I had to drive to the next town over and then buy my first SLR, like all within a pretty short time frame. And then by having to learn how to shoot stars, I kind of picked up all the other quirks and pieces of the puzzle. I don't think my earlier photography was really good, but one of the things that came up was that, the camera sort of became this companion. I could take it wherever I went. I could fit in. I didn't have to have awkward conversations with people. I would now get invited to things that I wouldn't normally get invited to because people wanted photos. And then suddenly I was like backstage and doing all these cool things. and then really quickly, like in 6 months, I was starting to earn money doing it. And I was like, oh, this is the first time ever I had a hobby that can now pay me something. So that's a pretty unique space and place to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing led to another. A year and a half later, I was like, oh shit, I got like 2 jobs right now. I got engineering and photography. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to have a hobby and a job. And so I ended up quitting photography, the job, like turning down all the weddings and events and stuff like that, and started moving my work more into fantasy and creativity. And so that's where a lot of the stylistic choices of having these elaborate sets and costumes started to come in and play. Fast forward 3.5 years later, I quit my day job as an engineer, not because I wanted to be an artist, but because I was like, I know for a fact that in 10 years, I don't want to be earning more money at a bigger desk doing the same general job. I don't know what I want to do, but I know what I don't want to do. And so I should probably quit. So tried to get fired so that I could get unemployment. They wouldn't fire me, so I quit. And essentially, the plan was to go to business school, get a GMAT, and so I did that exam, except I poorly planned it out. I quit in December, and so school wasn't really starting for a while, and so I ended up just traveling and doing this photography thing, and somehow that ended up working out. So what was essentially a sabbatical ended up becoming a career. I was an early day influencer. I was traveling, I was teaching, I was speaking at conferences, I was creating YouTube videos and Facebook videos, and trying my best to engage this following and doing bigger and bigger stunts online. So tying a model 30 meters underwater in a shipwreck in Bali, lighting people up on fires, dangling them off rooftops, and eventually started making a career out of it, becoming a commercial photographer. And so at one point I ended up getting the largest photography gig of my career at the time. I think in that one job, I earned more money than my entire career combined.
Wow.
And I think the smart thing to do would have been, well, I didn't make that much money, so I guess proportionally, it felt like a huge amount of money. And it was like, oh, I guess I've made it. Like, this is what it means to be a commercial photographer. But then I didn't really enjoy the process. It felt really empty. It felt kind of pointless. I couldn't see myself doing it for much longer. And I think the smart thing to do would have been to continue milking it for a while. I think that's what most people would do. I decided to take another sabbatical and say,
You're
all
like,
right,
I'm going to quit again.
I'm quitting again. Yeah, exactly. I'm just really good at quitting. And just all right, not going to do this. Let's figure out how to embed impact into this work. And it wasn't that I knew what kind of impact I wanted to have. I just knew that meaningful projects that had a soul to it, just made my heart sing. Those were the ones that I truly valued. And so I ended up watching a bunch of documentaries. I tried to take my skills and go to nonprofits and say hey, let's work together. Let's play. And these nonprofits were all like, you do really weird stuff, high risk, weird things. We're not into that. And so I ended up having to do all these experiments on my own earlier on, just to show how fantasy and impact could intersect and could coincide. And so some of my earlier stunts after wanting to do work in the environment were going storm chasing to raise awareness for climate change, using storms as a metaphor for climate change, or tying a model underwater with sharks swimming around for shark conservation. Or putting a mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles right around the time that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch had just been discovered. And it was only after I had kind of set a little bit of a track record of being able to combine these two fields that more project opportunities started to flow a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of coined this term of being an issue-driven artist. So the majority of the work that I know from you personally is your work with plastics and creating these huge sculptures and scenes out of them. Is that the majority of your work, or is it just kind of what I'm seeing? And why is plastic your focus?
Yeah, I think it's not so much that plastic is my focus. It's just the projects that I've had the most success on. And I'm not even 100% sure that it's a byproduct of the fact that my plastic work is my best work, as much as plastic is just an issue that everyone cares about, right? No one wants plastic in the ocean. And it's very simple and straightforward. Whereas when it comes to things like fast fashion or electronic waste, they're just a little bit broader, and people maybe have less of a visceral connection to it. Mm-hmm. The consequences of what it means to put electronic waste in the landfill and have those harmful metals leach out is just so much farther to us emotionally than plastic floating in the ocean when we're on the beach and seeing it and picking it up. So I think I generally have traditionally tackled the themes of overconsumption as a whole. But recently I have actually been trying to shift my work away from just focusing on what's wrong with the world and starting to think about what's right with the world. So a project that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks on Earth Overshoot Day. I'm not sure when your podcast comes out. We're releasing this project that I created in Thailand, which is a giant 6-meter tall phoenix made entirely out of biochar. Biochar is responsible for 89% of verified carbon removal credits. And this piece is made from 4 tons of carbon, which is the carbon footprint of the average person that is produced every single year. And so it's a kind of like a fun visualization of something that's normally invisible. But it also doesn't just talk about what's wrong with the world, like how much we're producing, but rather like what's right with the world, like what we could be doing about it.
If you want to see how absolutely amazing this sculpture turned out, you can scroll to the show notes and click on the link, or just Google biochar phoenix. Ben took the equivalent of the average person's yearly carbon footprint and turned it into an ominous, uplifting, jet black creature that's nearly 20 feet tall. With outstretched wings and glowing orange eyes, Carbon Phoenix brings much needed attention to the carbon capture that's possible through the biochar process.
And I think that by introducing a little bit more hope in my work, well, it helps me personally. I mean, I think like being in the environmental space is kind of a very depressing space to be with. Things just keep getting worse in so many ways. And there's been recently like a big focus on trying to think about also like what is more positive and optimistic about it.
And I was going to say that because I feel like a lot of the stuff that I've seen and some of the stuff that's come up in this conversation really is like, you're a guy who sees things that you don't like in the world, things that are wrong, and you're trying to bring attention to it as a way to change people's behaviors around it. But it's really interesting to hear that you're talking about you also want to bring spotlights to what we're doing right, the things that are hopeful and good and bring joy to people in a way that keeps you in the fight longer, right? It keeps you in this movement longer if you feel like there's growth, you feel like there's hope, and you're not just always focused on, wow, there's so much plastic.
Yeah, well, I think one of the realizations that I had was that, you know, when I was earlier in my career, I was like, if only more people knew about the problem, then change would happen. And then as time went on, I'm realizing like most people know about the problem and change is not happening. And so awareness doesn't necessarily lead to change. And so if you take an issue like plastics or even at this point like carbon and so forth, it's things that people who already care already know. And so what you're doing when you keep quote unquote raising awareness is you're raising frustration. You're just getting people to feel an increasing sense of hopelessness and helplessness with things. And so the messaging, the core messaging of who I'm trying to target in my work has actually shifted and changed over time. So while it initially started off with saying, the general public needs to know about this, these days, a lot of the work I do is at a slightly higher level. It's trying to figure out how can I influence policy makers with the work that I'm doing. And so I guess the most popular piece of work that I've created is this giant 4-story tall giant plastic tap that is spewing plastics all over the environment. And we created this in Nairobi, Kenya, where 1,500 delegates from 193 different countries were coming together to sign into place a global plastic treaty. And then that installation has now become sort of the symbol of that entire movement, where I think even the United Nations released it on the cover of their plastics report recently. It's like on the background of people's Zoom backgrounds when they have these calls. And it was recently re-invited to the global treaty negotiations that are still ongoing as a touring piece, and people use it to like protest what they're trying to do and to redirect the conversation and make sure that we're not just focusing on plastic pollution, but we're also going straight up to the source and focusing on plastic production.
One of the coolest things about this project is that Ben created a template for anyone who wants to keep the conversation alive to create their own miniature version of the plastic tap. Schools and community groups across the world have replicated his work in a smaller format to spark conversations among students, coworkers, and strangers. And the best part is that the files are free. Check out the show notes for a link.
And so I think that like my work, at least the intention behind my work these days, is really to figure out like, okay, well, it isn't going to be the everyday person that's going to be making a change on their own, because that choice has been taken away from us. When you go to a grocery store to buy stuff, unless you have the privilege and time to really be selective about where you go and what you purchase in the place that you live that has that option, you're really not being given much of a choice. And so it's really hard these days, I think, to make the right decision because the systems are set up for us to fail. And so if the systems are set up for us to fail, how do we design better systems to start with? And I think that's what I'm trying to do with my work. Now, of course, I'm an artist. I need to take work where it comes. I need to pick up opportunities whenever there are opportunities. And so these aren't so much rules as much as aspirations in terms of how I move through the world. So because I'm most famous for doing work with plastics, I keep getting asked to do more work with plastics. But then I have to kind of like break out of that and sort of force new conversations, even though that is what would be the best, I guess, horse to ride if I were just looking to create more and more projects.
I wanted to bring up a particular project that struck me as I was preparing for this episode, and that is your installation that is the Skull of Satoshi. Am I saying that right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So to briefly describe it, because this is an audio format, what I remember seeing of it, it's this 11-foot skull that is covered in e-waste, so cables and, broken single-use electronics and stuff like that. And it has smokestacks coming out of the top of the skull, and then the eyes are giant luminous Bitcoin symbols.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what that project is, what it meant to you, and what you were trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, for sure. So that was a commission from Greenpeace USA. We met in Greenland, where we're trying to talk about how we could leverage the power of blockchain to create more climate solutions. And I learned that Greenpeace was working on a campaign to figure out how to get Bitcoin to be more environmentally sustainable, because based on the data that they had, Bitcoin uses like 1.5% or so of the world's energy. And that energy was expected to just keep growing because the value of Bitcoin is continuing to grow. And so it's sort of like the worry is that actually Bitcoin does really well. And now you have all these computers crunching these calculations.
And it's using energy because you've got a computer that has to burn electricity to do the calculation, right?
Exactly.
It's flipping bits back and forth, and that takes electricity.
Right. And that's providing security to the system itself. So it's basically trading energy for security for the platform itself.
I hadn't heard the number that 1.5% of the world's energy was going to Bitcoin, to moving the blockchain along. That's wild.
Just specifically Bitcoin, yeah, not the other chains. So Bitcoin works on a proof of work model, and others work on like maybe a proof of stake model or otherwise. Proof of work specifically uses a lot of energy. And because it's decentralized, there's no way to actually attack it. So the Greenpeace theory of change was that if they could put enough pressure on it, specifically on the financial institutions that were backing Bitcoin, like Fidelity and BlackRock and all these different intermediaries like MasterCard and Visa that were enabling Bitcoin to be used on their platforms, that if they could put enough pressure on the value of Bitcoin, that maybe those who manage the nodes might be open to running a different version of Bitcoin that would be less energy intensive. I think something to that effect was their theory of change. And I think one of the challenges that they faced was like, oh, well, Bitcoin, when we talk about Bitcoin, like there's no symbol for it. There's no way of visualizing what this is. So they keep using stock images. And so we came up with this idea, or I came up with this idea that it would be really cool to, take this idea of death with a skull and give these coal smokestacks, because there were some stories of coal power plants reopening for Bitcoin miners because, the economics of running a coal factory were not doing so well. But then if the Bitcoin prices were right, that it would still be economically feasible to convert that energy to coal. And so having coal smokestacks and the Bitcoin laser eyes were just a cultural reference point. So anyways, we ended up creating that campaign. It ended up going fairly viral in the crypto space, primarily because the Bitcoin guys hated the campaign but thought the art was really cool. And so they decided to adopt the art kind of in the same way that Wall Street adopted the bull of Wall Street. And so it became kind of this odd flashpoint where it was the only thing that both Greenpeace and Bitcoiners could like agree upon.
Was that your art is really dope.
Yeah, that the art was really dope, and that it's funny because a lot of Bitcoiners believe that Bitcoin's actually more environmentally friendly than like the traditional banking system, because a banking system needs buildings, it needs people to run it, it needs a bunch of infrastructure, whereas Bitcoin doesn't need any of that. It's just computers running it. So depending on where you land, it seems like a fairly murky issue. It's funny because now, fast forward, it's been like 2 or 3 years, I almost wonder if like the conversation around Bitcoin matters less than the conversation around the energy consumption and the water consumption of artificial intelligence, which is undeniably growing at such a rapid rate that it almost makes like whatever was happening in the world of Bitcoin just completely irrelevant at this point.
Yeah, Chance and I were actually talking about artificial intelligence and how much energy that uses. We were talking about it the other day, and I realized I had never even thought about that as an issue. Is like, oh my gosh, there's so much energy being used here just to generate all of this knowledge and to crunch all these numbers and do all this stuff. And like, it just seems like this kind of nebulous thing. Like, it's like, oh, I go on Google and I do this and now I have this and great. And it doesn't seem like there's something behind it that's using up all of this energy to create that knowledge.
But even pre-AI, I mean, sending an email has a cost, right?
Yeah.
Storing an email has a cost.
Yeah. And I feel like that's something you just don't think about in your day-to-day life. Like, you don't realize that.
Yeah. And I feel like the couple times I've had the conversation with people, they're sort of filled with a similar sense of like hopelessness, because it's like, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to just not go on email? Are you going to not watch videos? Are you not going to interact with the modern world? It's like, it's really hard to do the right thing.
And you can't, I mean, you can't expect people to sacrifice their modern lives on the altar of this, like, I need to be this entity that is not having an impact and is not doing anything electronic, is not using any energy, because that's being a victim just as much as being, part of the people who've had their choice taken away, right? There's no good outcome in that world. So it's more about changing the systems, restoring the choice, and giving people the agency to make good choices again.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, it would the only choice would be the right choice, and the easiest choice would be the right choice too. But I just don't know if we've quite cracked that yet. But maybe the thing that gives hope is that we seem to be always trending in the right direction. I think, like, by and large, we are trending in the right direction, just not fast enough. There are other things that maybe worry me. It's like the barriers to trending in the right direction are like the growing sense of misinformation, or the growing amount of misinformation that's going on, the lack of social cohesion, or that social cohesion that we're losing, our lack of trust in institutions and facts. And so, like, those things are actually like hampering our ability to make good decisions and to move in the right direction. And so I do worry a little bit more about how AI affects those pieces of the puzzle. But
yeah, and something that gives me hope, kind of going back, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this new generation kind of coming into the workforce, right, that has the ideas like, oh, we need to save the planet, we need to be doing better, and now they're taking over these jobs eventually as older people are getting out of the business, and like, oh, like fossil fuels is the only option. This is the only way to do something. And I feel like the younger generation coming in now is like, okay, how can we be doing this better? And how can it be better for the planet? And like, that is still going to be a long road. But I think the younger generation coming in, like, just wants to do better for the planet.
yeah, I think on the one hand, I agree. I agree that, like, those are definitely the loudest voices. And then there's like an entire generation of people who just want to know whether or not they can afford to live in the city they want to live in and hang out with their friends and just live regular, ordinary lives. Mm-hmm. And those people just want a job.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, yes. And I wonder if sometimes in the environmental space, like the young voices, the youth voices on stages that we hear are actually they're not on the normal distribution curve. They're the edge cases.
Yeah.
And that by and large, we live in a world where, like, so many people are just hoping that they can figure out how to survive when, they've just survived COVID, and then now maybe they weren't able to graduate because of the protests that were going on campus. And it's like for so many people, they're just like, wait, what is this world that we're inheriting? And like, I don't even know how to like navigate it at this point. So.
Right. And I do like to think even someone who's just trying to like figure out how to live and make money, like a lot of us are, that when they're in a position, even if it's just your normal day-to-day job, maybe you have a say or an option to be like, hey, maybe we can reduce plastic here. Or like, I've noticed like less plastic is being used here. So like still, even if they're not in a huge company way far up that's like, you know what, we're cutting out fossil fuels, we're never going to do that again. It's the small things that just being aware of the issues that we have of like, oh, you know what, I remember hearing that this is an issue. Maybe this is a place that we can help. But I mean, that's also not going to be the case for everyone, like you said.
Yeah. But to bring it back to like, I guess, individual choice. And so like, I'm vegan, as an example. I started off being vegetarian for environmental reasons. And it was sort of this idea that like, I have so much optionality in life. Like I get to live as an artist, for God's sake. So I guess that's pretty wild. A job that no one has ever asked for is a job that I managed to hold on to. And so like, why go through the hassle of being vegetarian? It's like, will it really make a difference in like on a global scale what I eat on a daily basis? Not really, but every time I prepare a meal, I'm sort of reminding myself that like I have the power to make certain decisions in my life, and that I don't just need to go with the easiest, most obvious answer all the time. Like I can choose to make my life a little bit more inconvenient because I believe it is the right thing to do. And I think those little decisions that we make to do the right things is one of the only ways that we can sort of regain and retake back a certain amount of our agency, to remind ourselves that we aren't beholden to everything that we're told. And that we can figure out how we want to live. And so, of course, we're not going to get it all right. We're probably going to get most of it wrong. But we can start like sort of drawing these trenches in the sand, I guess, and just saying like, no, this is a line that I don't want to cross because I have the privilege of being able to like draw this line in the sand, and I'm gonna stick to it because I can. Right. And then to keep slowly like pushing that further and further back until you're able to affect greater levels of change and bring others along with you for the ride.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of value in intentionality. Being like, I know that I will not make the right choice 100% of the time, but I want to. I'm trying to.
Right.
And in making those choices, it builds a relationship between you and the thing that you're trying to protect, and just having that relationship influences you. It influences the people around you, and that grows. And it really does make a difference, even if it's not changing the laws or changing the manufacturing techniques. It does change consumer ideologies around what is good and what is acceptable.
Sure.
And I think that that's a really important catalyst and starting point.
Yeah. And I think even if we look, even to just make that entirely selfish for a moment, it also changes like the friendships and the relationships and the activities that you do. And so by living as much as possible to the standards of your values, you'll start meeting other people who share similar values. And as a byproduct of that, your network will improve in quality. Your friendships will become tighter. You'll start doing things that are more aligned. And so like there's an entire like sort of cascading set of benefits as an individual to trying to live up to these values that are much more aspirational than they are absolute.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Wow, that was a fun little rabbit hole we just went down.
I know, right?
I really liked that. That was a lot of fun.
Going back to your artwork a little bit, do you have a piece that you're most proud of?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already talked about it. Although I'm an artist, I think I'm much more of an activist than an artist. And so for me, generally, what I feel most proud of are the projects that I feel like have made the greatest difference. Ironically, there's like not really any easy way of measuring what that impact is. So if you had asked me this question a couple years ago, I would have probably said this project where I put a mermaid on 10,000 plastic bottles, because it ended up getting like 37 million views on like the native video alone, and got published in so many different papers and news articles. And it's still, like, for the most part, seems to be a crowd favorite, a crowd pleaser, one that really resonates with people when I show it to them and they see it and they react to it. But then the project that's probably had the greatest impact these days is that giant plastic tap sculpture that I created, because it's managed to sort of infiltrate the halls of power, and it's a consistently referenced source within like political and policy conversations, which I think is just kind of wild to me, that the art has actually grown and become more popular than me. So like I'll go to a conference and people will be like, oh my gosh, you're the person behind the tap. Like I've seen that tap everywhere. And I'm like, wow, this is great. Like this piece of art is so much more famous than I am. How cool. And to constantly like strive to do more like this. There's a project that I'm really excited to bring to life in October. I want to build a giant 2.5 story tall tower of Jenga blocks that looks like they're about to topple over, where each and every one of the blocks represent a unique and different ecosystem. So we're going to talk about biodiversity loss and the importance of rebalancing nature. And we'll see where we actually get permission to build this, but it'll be happening during COP16, which is the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, where 196 countries are going to be coming together to unveil how they're supposed to be protecting 30% of the world by 2030. And so to try to like create a piece like this, which is taking a very abstract visual that no one can quite explain, right? Biodiversity, it's like really hard to explain how biodiversity is on the verge of collapsing, and giving it form and giving it feeling and giving it an opportunity for people to stand next to it and speak to it. I'm hoping that it will grow into the next big success. But who knows? You never know with these things. You just do the best you can. It'll also be happening very close to the elections. So we'll see how that goes.
There'll be a lot of conversations.
Yeah. That sounds like an amazing project. And I feel like I have to ask this question. How long did it take you to create the tap art piece? Like how many hours went into that? Do you even know?
Yeah. So I've made multiple versions of the faucet at this point. I think there's like 4 or 5 of them. The building of most art installations is actually the easy part. That takes maybe a week or 2. Mm-hmm. If it's a really involved project, it's like a month, let's say. But what really takes a lot of time is everything else around it, like planning for it, getting all the permissions, collecting the materials, cleaning the materials, sorting the materials, getting the funds, finding the right partnerships in order to bring the whole thing to life. I mean, I would say on average, a project takes like 6 months to bring to life, start to finish.
Wow.
but the actual doing of the art is sort of pretty quick. Yeah.
I would love to get your take on something that I chew on a lot, and it's the role of activism, and specifically like disruptive activism, in the public consciousness and in bringing conversations to light. And I'm kind of on the fence on some of the stuff where it feels like it actually damages public perception of the issue. You know, some of the like stop oil stuff that's happened, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's a good representation of activism as a whole, but I do think it is very much at the forefront of that conversation. So just going to kind of throw that ball in your court, and I want to hear your thoughts on that philosophy.
So it's funny because when we think of like who is the most effective activist or which organization is the most effective group, I don't know if we can really truly answer that question, because the purpose of the entire movement is to like move the center, right? And to move the center, that means you're going to have some folks on the right and you're going to have some folks on the left, and everyone has a role to play. And so if we take plastics, which is the thing that I know the most about, you can have a group like Greenpeace doing a bunch of stunts in front of these conferences and saying, we need to cut plastic production by 70% by 2030. And then, and that's like cool. It's like they have a bold, ambitious goal. It's calculated. It's reasoned. It's set. But then when you go into like a room with a bunch of business people, they'll just be like, those guys are completely unrealistic. This is not going to happen. And then maybe a more conservative group like WWF might be able to come in and say like, hey guys, look, we're only going to go for like 50% reduction by 2030 or 30% reduction by 2030. Not like those lunatics out there. But like the truth is like everyone's kind of on the same side because the purpose is to move the center. And so you have people that are pushing really hard and saying we should just divest from everything. We need to stop everything and you know, climate emergency now. And then you have other folks who are like over there, and everyone kind of has a role to play. And as long as the center is moving along, of course, it would be great if it went faster. As long as you're not preventing the center from moving along, then I think you understand that you're part of an ecosystem of change. And so the problem probably arises more when people see themselves as like the most effective or the only way forward. So long as everyone sees themselves as playing a role, I think these kind of wheels of progress can actually happen. But I guess I'm thinking more of societal change as less of the version of change, which is like we need to stop everything. We need to break everything. We need to start over. I think it's because I just generally feel that like we can't do that without actually hurting and harming a lot of people. Like if we take something like COVID, which you might say, oh, it was great, like the whole world stopped, we adapted, but like a ton of people got hurt along the way. Like right. Poverty rates like reversed for the first time in like, I don't know, the last 50 years or something, where like there's more poverty today than there was like a couple years back, which has never happened. And like there's so many people that are still recovering from that economically that have really, really struggled. And so I think that we need to be really careful about like completely tearing down systems, because those will also come with a shit ton of consequences. And that's even if we believed it was possible to start with.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I was hoping from that, is just to kind of like throw it at you and get your initial response, because I think that it's important to have, it's really easy to write stuff off, right?
Sure.
And just be like, that's this thing and I'm going to immediately judge it. And then it's out of my mind forever. And I think that just having conversations about every aspect of this, right, across the full spectrum, is how we move the center. It's how we keep progress happening and in fact, even accelerate it. So thank you very much for that. I know that was probably kind of that's a harder question than I typically like to ask, but I think that
No, I think it's a good question to be asking. And of course, people are going to agree and disagree on it. So it's like there's always this sort of, and this is probably something interesting to talk about, is that there's so much judgment within the environmental space from one activist to another. I mean, I catch it within myself where I'll go to like a climate conference and then there'll be like beef on the table and I'll be like, how? Like, why are we still here? Like, and there'll be a judgment, but then also like just kind of like try to like calm that down and say, well, that's not really the point, right? Like, yes, we can always do better. Maybe it's worth bringing it up with an organizer just to like voice an opinion, but then not like let that color the entire tenor of every interaction that's there, because that's not really why we're here. So yeah,
I think that's the hard personal work that we have to do in this space, is to accept people where they are and to actively open ourselves up to people with other perspectives and treat them as human and as people who also have a stake in this fight. I mean, climate change is not, it doesn't happen along party lines. It's not like if you vote this way, it doesn't affect you. And if you vote that way, it does affect you. It happens to every single human being that lives on this planet. So we should talk about it and think about every other human being as part of the solution to this and working towards something that's going to outlast us.
Well, I'm very excited to see your next couple of sets of work, and this episode will be released during sometime in October or November, but hopefully we'll also have some updates from you and new work that you've done.
Thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope you got a lot from that episode. Chance and I really enjoyed talking to Ben. And as you could tell throughout the episode, there's clearly been a lot of updates about his artwork. One that I'm really excited about and want to talk more about is his installation of like the Jenga tower showing biodiversity loss at COP16. So that one will be officially launched on October 20th. So just in a few days from when this episode goes out.
I love a good metaphor. And usually the metaphor I lean on when I'm talking about how biodiversity loss affects the whole system is like biodiversity is like all the parts in a car that have to work together. Like that's what's in the ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like a little salty because his metaphor is so much better than mine. I love the metaphor of biodiversity loss as a Jenga tower, where like the tower still exists as you pull blocks out of it. But at some point, you pull that one last block that could cause it all to collapse.
Yeah, it all just falls over. And y'all, I was talking to Ben today, and he sent me some pictures of the Jenga tower, and it looks so cool.
I haven't even seen those yet. Will you send them to me right now?
Yeah, I will. It's just like, it's full of light and these plants, and it's just amazing. I mean, there's reefs, there's water in parts of it, there's like leaves, and like it's crazy.
No,
honestly.
seriously, airdrop me the photos while we're recording right now. I want to see them.
Okay, I'm sending them now. And if y'all want to see these,
oh my gosh.
Obviously you can wait until the 20th and they'll probably be all over the place, but you can also, I really like following Ben on Instagram. His Instagram handle is Wong, Vonwong. And he's been posting some updates in collaboration with other people about the creation and the behind the scenes of making this. And it looks so cool.
Each block looks like a little aquarium or like a little terrarium thing.
Yeah, it's insane. And it goes up to describe this picture. So it like starts at like this bluish purple color on the bottom. These pictures are taken at like dusk. So it's like this bluish purple color, and then it goes to green, and then like orange and yellow at the top. And there's a bunch of foliage at the top, but you just kind of have to see it to believe it. It's really cool.
I want to do that. Maybe we'll just paint our Jenga blocks at home.
There you go. Like create like a little ecoscape on each one.
Might be a little dark when we play it though.
That's fair. Yeah.
You know what? Something else that's really cool about it that you told me, I think yesterday, is that he actually was able to license the name Jenga from Hasbro.
Yeah, they got approval. They like wrote them and were like, hey, can we use this for this project? And Hasbro was like, go for it, I guess. Is basically the story that I saw.
That's pretty cool. I like it when big companies like that have been around for a long time are willing to put their names behind some of these larger, activist things that can so frequently be kind of controversial in the public space.
Yeah, I think it's really cool to see that, especially when so much of what we see, right? We've already talked about this. I feel like we mentioned in the last episode and kind of in the beginning of this, like you see so much negative. It's nice to see positive and collaboration and people lifting other people up. I think a lot of the times we see really extreme examples, right?
Really polarizing examples of activism that are, arguably dividing people instead of trying to rally people together around a cause.
Right. And we talked about that some in the episode, and I want to touch on it a little bit more because you and I didn't talk about this so much in the episode. We got Ben's opinion, but I kind of want to discuss our opinions as well. So my opinion on like the really extreme environmental activism. So obviously this episode was all about art. I grew up with my mom being an artist. And so I personally don't love to see like activists throwing cans of soup on paintings, even if they're covered with glass, whatever. Like, I just don't feel like that's the best way to get the message out there. But I also don't know what the best way is. I mean, people have gone to these extremes because no one's listening. Companies aren't listening, right? So it's like, how do we make them listen? And I know that's probably a controversial thought, but I'm also like, I don't know how I feel about it. I don't feel good about it.
I think that's one of the things that I liked most about Ben's response to it was that it becomes a problem when people are looking for the best way to do something because there is no single fit answer for it, right? Mm-hmm. You have to do what is authentic to you and feels like you are able to contribute. Personally, I can't ever see myself expecting good things to happen from vandalism like that, but I also, here we are on a podcast with a platform discussing these stunts, right? And so it does cause conversation, and conversation can lead to change. But on the flip side, the conversations for people who are not aligned with environmental causes is like, oh, I'm going to run my diesel truck for an extra hour to offset any good that they might be doing. You know, by inciting frustration and aggression in people, it causes more of a division instead of trying to heal those fractures and bring people together. And that, you know, that's my personal take on it.
Yeah, and I think we also talk about the fact that I kind of think everyone knows about climate change right now, and they know how they feel about it, and there are people who can change their mind, and of course everyone can change their mind, but at this point, these extreme stunts aren't really bringing new information to anyone. It's just showing people that we're really angry.
Completely fair, and a very valid thing to make known is that this isn't like just kids play stuff. We're playing with people's lives and livelihoods. But at the same time, anger is not a very useful emotion in negotiation.
But it is, I feel like, very utilized in negotiation these days. You know, I don't feel like most people can have a level-headed conversation when they don't agree on things.
And we need more of that. I think that that's how stuff gets done, in my personal opinion, is finding common ground as opposed to finding differences.
Right. And, you know, we're both science people, right? We both come from science backgrounds. So my mind goes to like, oh, I want to see the statistics on what has the impact been of these extreme activism stunts. Has it actually changed people's minds, or have we seen a negative effect where people who are like, oh yeah, you know, I care about the planet and I want to help climate change, they see these stunts and they're like, what the heck? Like, I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be involved with that.
Yeah, I would love to see the academic research, which I'm sure there is. If you guys know about papers, please text the hotline 706-505-0582 because I want to read some more about the actual effects of these large-scale disruptive stunts.
So with that, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. It was another one of our wonderful episodes recorded at the Sun Valley Forum this year.
And I just want to take a second to talk about how much I love the Sun Valley Forum because it's one of those conferences, like sometimes you go to an environmental conference and it's thousands of people and there's cool people on stage for sure, but you don't really feel connected with the other attendees. And that is not the case at Sun Valley. At the Sun Valley Forum, you really feel like you can walk up to literally anybody, including Dr. Sylvia Earle, and just have a conversation with them about what's happening in the space and their thoughts on it. So just a really, really awesome opportunity that we had to go out there and record these stories out in Idaho this past summer.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite parts about the forum. And I mean, we had Dr. Sylvia Earle on the show while we were at EarthX, and we actually released an episode that quoted her while we were in Sun Valley. So we had her come and record that quote for us. And then she was even kind enough to film a little video for one of our previous guests and friend of mine, Will, to be like, hey, what's up?
Hi, Will. Hope you're listening.
So that was just really fun, and the people there were really great. I mean, it's also a beautiful place and a really nice way for Chance and I to kind of get back into nature and enjoy that space while we're there as well.
So with all that, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next week.